restoration of them, please?
Yeah, and Senator Booker, I had stated earlier that yes, we did terminate grants. We have an appeal process. We have turned some back on. We are appealing. We are looking at some. Some we have denied. Some are still pending. I believe we have multiple appeals pending with New Jersey, and I would be happy to sit down with you and look at those appeals. I believe one is with the city of New Jersey. I know there are multiple ones pending, but of course, I would be happy to sit down with you or any senator or any House member and look at grants that have been terminated. I've been doing that, and I would welcome.
Okay, so Pam Bondi just had an absolutely catastrophic meltdown in federal court, and we're talking about the kind of courtroom explosion that doesn't just damage her reputation, it fundamentally undermines the entire legal strategy of the Trump administration at a moment when they can least afford it. This wasn't some minor outburst or a heated exchange with opposing counsel. This was a full-scale, unhinged tirade that got so out of control that the presiding judge had no choice but to have her physically removed from the courtroom. And here's what makes this so much worse. Pam Bondi isn't just any attorney. She's Trump's hand-picked attorney general, the person who's supposed to be leading the Justice Department, defending the administration's most controversial policies, and presenting a composed, authoritative face to the federal judiciary. Instead, what we got was a public spectacle that's now being described by legal observers as one of the most unprofessional displays they've ever witnessed in a federal courtroom. The White House is in full damage control mode right now. Republicans on Capitol Hill are privately furious, and legal experts are openly questioning whether Bondi has the temperament and judgment to hold one of the most powerful positions in American government. This isn't just embarrassing. This is a constitutional crisis wrapped in a professional disaster, and it's happening at exactly the wrong time for an administration that's already facing unprecedented legal challenges on multiple fronts. Now, before we get into exactly what happened in that courtroom and why this matters so much more than it might seem at first glance, let me say something really important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll give you the surface-level drama, the clips, the reactions, but they won't connect the dots. They won't tell you what this actually means for the balance of power, for the legitimacy of the Justice Department, for Trump's entire second-term agenda. That's why we built Politic Insane, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this courtroom disaster. Do you think Bondi should resign, or is this just being blown out of proportion? I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Pam Bondi was appearing before Judge Kathleen Williams, a George W. Bush appointee with a reputation for running an extremely disciplined courtroom in a case that has massive implications for Trump's executive authority. The case involves whether the administration can use emergency powers to redirect federal funding away from states that refuse to cooperate with immigration enforcement policies. It's a huge test of presidential power, and it's exactly the kind of case where the Attorney General needs to be at the absolute top of her game, presenting calm, reasoned legal arguments backed by precedent and constitutional interpretation. Instead, what happened was something completely different. According to multiple sources who were in the courtroom, including reporters, legal clerks, and even some attorneys on the government's own team, Bondi began her oral arguments in a relatively normal fashion, laying out the administration's position on executive discretion and the scope of emergency authorities. But then Judge Williams started asking pointed questions about the legal basis for the funding cuts, specifically whether the administration had followed proper notice and comment procedures required under the Administrative Procedure Act. And that's when things started to go sideways. Bondi's responses became increasingly defensive, her tone shifted from professional to combative, and instead of addressing the judge's concerns with legal reasoning, she started making what can only be described as personal attacks on the credibility of the states bringing the lawsuit. She accused them of playing politics, of deliberately undermining national security, of putting illegal immigrants ahead of American citizens. Now, passionate advocacy is one thing. Attorneys are supposed to argue zealously for their clients. But what Bondi did next crossed a line that you simply cannot cross in federal court. When Judge Williams tried to redirect her back to the specific legal questions at hand, Bondi reportedly raised her voice, interrupted the judge multiple times, and at one point actually said, And I'm quoting from the official court transcript here. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this court doesn't seem to understand what's actually at stake for the American people." Let that sink in for a moment. The Attorney General of the United States in open court essentially told a federal judge that she doesn't understand the law or the facts of the case. Judge Williams, who has been on the bench for nearly 2 decades and is known for being extremely patient and fair, immediately warned Bondi that she was approaching contempt of court. She told her in very clear terms to compose herself to address the legal questions being asked and to show proper respect for the proceedings. And here's where this turns from bad to absolutely catastrophic. Instead of taking the warning seriously, instead of stepping back and recalibrating her approach, Bondi doubled down. She continued to talk over the judge. She gestured wildly with her hands, and according to eyewitness accounts, she actually slammed a binder full of legal briefs onto the podium so hard that it made a loud bang that echoed through the courtroom. At that point, Judge Williams had seen enough. She called for the marshals, declared Bondi in contempt of court, and ordered her immediate removal from the proceedings. U.S. Marshals literally had to escort the Attorney General out of the courtroom while she was still trying to argue her case. The entire scene was so chaotic, so unprecedented, that there was actually a several-minute recess called so that everyone in the courtroom could collect themselves. The government's legal team had to scramble to find a replacement attorney to continue the oral arguments, and by all accounts, the entire proceeding was thrown into absolute disarray. And this is where things start to unravel even further, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. This courtroom disaster comes at a time when the Trump administration is facing some of the most consequential legal battles of the entire presidency. There are cases pending on immigration policy, on tariffs and emergency economic powers, on executive privilege, on the limits of presidential authority over federal agencies. The Justice Department is literally fighting on multiple fronts right now, and the person who's supposed to be leading that fight, the person who's supposed to be the calm, strategic, authoritative voice defending the administration's positions, just got dragged out of federal court for losing control. Think about what message that sends to every other federal judge who's currently hearing cases involving Trump administration policies. Think about what message that sends to career attorneys at the Department of Justice who are supposed to be working under Bondi's leadership. Think about what message that sends to state attorneys general, to Congress, to foreign governments who are watching how the American legal system is functioning right now. This isn't just about one bad day in court. This is about the fundamental credibility of the Justice Department as an institution. Now, let's talk about the legal and institutional mechanisms at play here, because this matters enormously. Contempt of court is not some procedural technicality. It's one of the most serious sanctions a judge can impose, and it exists for a very specific reason: to protect the integrity and dignity of the judicial process. Federal courts operate on a foundation of mutual respect between the bench and the bar. Judges have enormous power. They can decide the constitutionality of laws, they can issue injunctions that halt government actions, they can send people to prison. But that power is balanced by strict rules of decorum and procedure that ensure everyone gets a fair hearing and that the process remains orderly and rational. Attorneys, in turn, have a professional obligation to zealously represent their clients, but they also have a duty to the court itself. They're officers of the court, which means they're expected to conduct themselves with professionalism, to follow the rules of evidence and procedure, and to treat judges with respect, even when they disagree with their rulings. When an attorney, any attorney, but especially the Attorney General of the United States, violates those norms so egregiously that they have to be physically removed from the courtroom, it undermines the entire system. It suggests that the government doesn't respect the rule of law, that it views the courts as obstacles to be bulldozed rather than as co-equal branches of government with legitimate authority to review executive actions. And here's the constitutional dimension that makes this so much more serious than just a bad moment for Pam Bondi personally. The Attorney General isn't just the government's top lawyer. The AG is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, the person responsible for ensuring that federal laws are faithfully executed, that the Justice Department operates with integrity and independence, and that the government's legal positions are grounded in sound constitutional principles. When you have an attorney general who can't control her temper in court, who treats federal judges with open disrespect, who gets sanctioned for contempt, you have a serious problem with the rule of law. Because if the person leading the Justice Department doesn't respect judicial authority, why should anyone else? If the attorney general thinks she can bully or intimidate judges into ruling her way, what does that say about the administration's view of separation of powers. This isn't about political disagreements or policy disputes. This is about whether the executive branch recognizes that it operates within constitutional limits or whether it sees itself as above the law. The case that Bondi was arguing when she melted down is itself incredibly significant. At issue is whether the president can unilaterally withhold federal funding from states that refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. The administration argues that under existing emergency powers statutes, the president has broad discretion to redirect funds in order to protect national security. The states argue that this violates the appropriations clause of the Constitution, which gives Congress, not the president, the power of the purse. They also argue that it violates the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires federal agencies to follow specific procedures when they make policy changes that affect state governments. This is exactly the kind of separation of powers question that gets decided by careful judicial analysis of text, precedent, and constitutional structure. It requires attorneys on both sides to present well-reasoned arguments backed by case law. It requires judges to weigh competing interpretations and to apply established legal principles. What it doesn't require, and what it absolutely cannot tolerate, is an attorney general having a public meltdown and refusing to follow basic courtroom protocols. Because when that happens, the legal merits of the case get overshadowed by the spectacle, and the government's position loses credibility, not because the arguments are weak, but because the person making them demonstrated that she can't be trusted to engage in good faith legal discourse. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because the implications here are massive and they ripple out in multiple directions. First, understand that this is a credibility crisis for the Justice Department at the worst possible time. The DOJ is currently involved in hundreds of cases across the country, many of them involving controversial Trump administration policies. Career attorneys at the department are supposed to be able to walk into courtrooms and present arguments with the full weight and authority of the United States government behind them. But when the Attorney General herself gets dragged out of court for contempt, it raises serious questions about whether DOJ attorneys can be trusted to behave professionally. Judges who might have been inclined to give the government the benefit of the doubt on close legal questions are now going to be far more skeptical. They're going to wonder whether the legal positions being presented are based on sound analysis or whether they're just politically motivated arguments dressed up in legal language. That's a huge problem for the administration because so much of Trump's agenda depends on winning in federal court. Second, this creates an enormous political liability heading into the 2026 midterms. Democrats were already planning to make Trump's authoritarian tendencies a central theme of their campaigns, arguing that he doesn't respect democratic norms or constitutional limits. Well, now they have a perfect example to point to: the Attorney General of the United States getting thrown out of court for disrespecting a federal judge. That's going to show up in campaign ads and debate talking points and fundraising emails. It's going to be used as evidence that the Trump administration is fundamentally lawless, that it doesn't respect judicial authority, that it's a threat to the rule of law. And here's the thing, it's not a distortion or an exaggeration. It's literally what happened. Republicans who might have wanted to defend the administration's policies are now going to have to defend or distance themselves from Bondi's behavior, and neither option is particularly appealing. Defending her makes them look like they're okay with contempt for the judiciary. Distancing themselves from her makes them look weak and creates divisions within the party. Third, this raises serious questions about Trump's judgment in selecting his cabinet. Pam Bondi was supposed to be a safe, experienced choice for Attorney General. She'd been Florida's Attorney General. She'd worked on Trump's legal team during his first impeachment. She had relationships on Capitol Hill. She was supposed to be someone who could navigate the complicated legal and political challenges of the job. Instead, what we're seeing is someone who apparently can't control her emotions under pressure, who doesn't have the temperament to handle high-stakes litigation, and who just created one of the biggest legal embarrassments of Trump's presidency. That reflects poorly on Trump's ability to choose competent people for critical positions. It raises questions about whether loyalty is being prioritized over competence and whether the administration is capable of functioning effectively when the people at the top can't handle the responsibilities of their offices. Fourth, think about the international implications here. America's allies and adversaries are watching how our government functions, and what they're seeing right now is chaos. When the Attorney General gets dragged out of court for contempt, That sends a signal that the American legal system is dysfunctional, that the rule of law is breaking down, that the United States is becoming less stable and predictable. For allies who depend on American leadership and consistency, that's deeply concerning. For adversaries like Russia and China who benefit from American weakness and distraction, that's an opportunity. They can point to episodes like this and say, see, American democracy is failing. Their institutions are collapsing. They're not the stable, reliable partner they claim to be. That undermines American credibility on the world stage, and it makes it harder for the United States to play the leadership role that it's played for decades. Fifth, this has enormous implications for the specific case that was being argued. The government's legal position just took a massive hit, not because the arguments themselves are necessarily wrong, but because the person presenting them behaved so unprofessionally that the judge had to remove her from the courtroom. When judges are writing their opinions, when they're deciding how to rule on the merits, they're going to remember this moment. They're going to remember that the administration's top lawyer couldn't control herself, couldn't respect the court, couldn't follow basic rules of decorum. That doesn't mean they'll rule against the government purely out of spite, but it does mean that they're going to be far less inclined to give the administration the benefit of the doubt on close legal questions. If the government's arguments are weak, judges are going to be less willing to stretch to find a way to rule in their favor. And in a case this consequential, where the stakes are this high, that could be the difference between winning and losing. Now, here's what's happening behind the scenes, and this is where the story gets even more interesting. Multiple sources inside the White House and the Justice Department are saying that Bondi's outburst wasn't a complete surprise. Apparently, there have been concerns for weeks about her behavior, about her ability to handle the pressure of the job, about her tendency to become combative when challenged. People close to the situation have been describing her as increasingly erratic, particularly as the administration's legal losses have started to pile up. There's talk of her clashing with career attorneys at DOJ, of her refusing to listen to advice from experienced litigators, of her insisting on strategies that more seasoned lawyers think are counterproductive. The courtroom meltdown is being seen by some inside the administration as the inevitable result of someone who was never really equipped for this job being put in a position where she's constantly overmatched. And here's the really damaging part. There are now whispers that Trump is furious with her, not because he cares about judicial decorum or the rule of law, but because she made him look bad. Trump hates looking weak, he hates losing, and he especially hates when people who are supposed to be representing him create public spectacles that dominate the news cycle for all the wrong reasons. There's talk that he's considering replacing her, but of course that would create its own problems because it would be an admission that his choice was a disaster, and Trump hates admitting mistakes. Let's also talk about what this means for the broader project of judicial reform and the relationship between the executive and judicial branches. Over the past few years, there's been an ongoing debate about whether federal courts have become too political, whether judges are overstepping their authority by blocking executive actions, whether the judiciary needs to show more deference to the elected branches of government. The Trump administration has been at the center of that debate, arguing that unelected judges shouldn't be able to halt presidential policies, especially on issues like immigration and national security. Now, you can have a legitimate debate about those issues. You can argue about the proper balance between judicial review and executive authority. But what you can't do is have your attorney general get dragged out of court for contempt and then claim that the problem is with the judiciary. Because at that point, the problem isn't judicial overreach. The problem is an executive branch that doesn't respect basic legal processes and courtroom decorum. It completely undermines any serious argument about judicial reform when the person making that argument can't even follow the rules of civil procedure. And then there's the question of what happens next in this specific case. The government still needs to present its arguments, but now it has to do so without its attorney general, with a legal team that's been thrown into chaos, and with a judge who just had to sanction the nation's top law enforcement officer for contempt. The replacement attorneys who step in are going to be walking into an incredibly difficult situation. They're going to have to somehow rehabilitate the government's position, convince the judge that they're serious and professional, and overcome the massive credibility hit that just occurred. That's a nearly impossible task, and it wouldn't be surprising if the government ends up losing this case not on the merits, but because Bondi's behavior poisoned the well so thoroughly that the court simply can't take the administration's arguments seriously anymore. There's also the question of whether Bondi will face any formal consequences beyond being removed from the courtroom. Contempt of court can result in fines or even jail time in extreme cases, though it's unlikely that a sitting attorney general would actually be incarcerated. But judges have a lot of discretion in how they enforce contempt orders, and Judge Williams could decide to impose sanctions that would be deeply embarrassing for Bondi and for the administration. She could issue a formal written opinion detailing exactly why Bondi's conduct was inappropriate, creating a public record that will follow her for the rest of her career. She could refer the matter to the State Bar Association for potential disciplinary proceedings. She could even cite the incident in her eventual ruling on the case, using it as evidence that the government isn't operating in good faith. Any of those outcomes would be devastating for Bondi's reputation and for the administration's legal strategy. And let's think about the precedent this sets, because that's perhaps the most concerning thing of all. If the Attorney General of the United States can behave this way in federal court and face no meaningful consequences beyond being removed from one hearing, what message does that send to other government attorneys? What message does it send to Trump administration officials who are testifying before Congress or appearing in court? It essentially says that the rules don't really apply, that you can be as combative and disrespectful as you want as long as you're loyal to Trump. That's a recipe for institutional breakdown, for a complete erosion of professional norms that have held the legal system together for centuries. And once those norms are gone, they're incredibly difficult to rebuild. You can't just snap your fingers and restore respect for the judiciary after the Attorney General has demonstrated that she thinks judges are obstacles to be bullied rather than authorities to be respected. So here's the bottom line. Pam Bondi's courtroom meltdown isn't just a personal embarrassment or a bad news cycle for the White House. It's a fundamental crisis for the Justice Department, a massive political liability for Trump heading into 2026, and a serious blow to the credibility of the United States government both domestically and internationally. It demonstrates that the administration is willing to sacrifice professionalism and respect for the rule of law in favor of loyalty and combativeness. It shows that Trump's judgment in selecting his cabinet is deeply flawed, and it creates a situation where federal judges across the country are now going to be far more skeptical of anything the government says in court because they've seen what happens when the administration's top lawyer doesn't get her way. This is the kind of moment that defines a presidency, that becomes a turning point in how the public and the institutions of government view an administration. And right now, the view isn't good. The Justice Department is supposed to be the institution that upholds the rule of law, that ensures justice is administered fairly and impartially, that represents the government with integrity and professionalism. Instead, what we have is an attorney general who got dragged out of court for contempt, a White House in damage control mode, and a growing sense that this administration doesn't respect the very legal system it's supposed to be defending. Keep your eyes on this because the fallout is just beginning. Judge Williams still has to issue her ruling in the underlying case, and you can bet it's not going to be favorable to the government after what just happened. There will be calls from Democrats for Bondi to resign, and probably even some quiet suggestions from Republicans that Trump needs to make a change. And every single case the Justice Department is currently litigating just got a lot harder to win because judges remember moments like this. This could define the next 2 years of Trump's presidency, and it could reshape how federal courts interact with the executive branch for a generation. This story is far from over, and the consequences are going to reverberate for a long time to come.